The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. Now, this is actually our second episode on John Marshall as part of the special series, A Seat at the Table. As I was starting to think about approaching John Marshall in his role as Secretary of State, I knew that once we got past his cabinet years, we really got to the heart of why John Marshall is remembered in the present day. And we really got to the point of his greatest impact in American history. And so it just seemed to be doing a disservice to that life and legacy to just do one episode and kind of have that wrapped up in a very short amount of time. And thus, I invited on some special guests to help us to understand a bit more about Marshall's time after he left the cabinet and joined the Supreme Court and during his tenure as Chief Justice. So I'm very pleased and so grateful to be joined by Ben Lovelace and Matthew Nickel, who are museum educators at the John Marshall House in Richmond, Virginia. Ben and Matthew, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So before we get started, I wanted to give both of y'all an opportunity to introduce yourselves and tell us a bit more about the John Marshall House and your work there.
So I'm Ben, by the way, Ben Lovelace. I'm a museum educator with Preservation Virginia. We are a statewide nonprofit that operate a number of historic sites. Me and my friend Matthew here, we work specifically out of the John Marshall House in Richmond, Virginia. Our work really just revolves all around John Marshall, his life, his impact, his legacy, and of course, some of the people that are closest to him. So we are responsible for developing educational programs. We do special tours. We do virtual learning stuff. Over the years, we've really begun to kind of expand the different facets of history that we're exploring. So we have programs ranging from Revolutionary War history to judicial history to the history of enslavement and its impact on Marshall's legacy.
And I'm Matthew Nickel. I'm a museum educator here as well. I have not been here as long as Ben has. He's been here for a few years now. I just got started in early 2021. So I'm kind of finding my secure footing here now in 2022. But as for me, my particular focus is legal legacies. And also we have other programs, specifically including John Marshall service in all three branches of the federal government. So that really, I think, will be relevant to the viewers of this podcast who are interested in learning more about how Marshall's service in the executive and the legislative branches really carried over and turned his judicial career into the one that is so well remembered. So that's really what I'm most excited for through this opportunity here. But also here at the John Marshall House, we really do remember, of course, the people who made that life possible. And that's, of course, not just the 8 to 16 enslaved individuals who were at the house at any given time, but also upwards of about 250 to 300 people across his numerous properties in the state of Virginia, mostly in Henrico and Fauquier counties. Those people, the wealth that was accrued through their labor really made John Marshall's 34 years, his ability to sit back, take so much time to put careful thought into his court opinions that we remember and that judges to this very day continue to cite. That really has the continued impact as it goes forward. So I know I didn't talk as much about myself there and kind of delved more into our spiel, but that really is, I think, my biggest focus every day when I go to work at the John Marshall House.
Yeah, and I have no doubt we're going to be digging into a lot of that history in the coming minutes here.
Absolutely. I was just about to say in your introduction, you hit on quite a few points and really what makes John Marshall such an important figure to study, because there is so much to unpack about his life, his legacy, what he meant for his time, and what it means for our time. And so to get us started thinking about that, and especially thinking of his role in the court, naturally, as this was early on in the history of the Supreme Court, the court operated during Marshall's tenure much differently than it does nowadays. In terms of how the court functions, what impact did John Marshall as Chief Justice have? And beyond the obvious changes that come with general technological advancements, how different was the court at the end of his tenure from how the Supreme Court functions today?
Well, I can start by saying that it vastly expands the assumed jurisprudence of the court. In John Jay, the first Chief Justice, in his 8 years as Chief Justice, he saw 8 cases, which is unbelievable for our modern eyes today. It seems the Supreme Court is almost always looking at cases. And really, John Marshall's the one who's responsible for that. In John Marshall's 34 years on the court, he saw over 1,100 cases, which is just a significantly higher number there. The Jay Court heard very few cases. They did hear largely the ones that had to do with contract disputes and maritime law. That would serve to have a pretty significant precedent there. But John Jay left after 8 years because he saw the job as lacking in, and these are his words, energy, wit, and dignity. He decided to run for a statewide seat as governor of New York rather than be a lifetime appointment as Chief Justice. And so really John Marshall is, coincidentally enough, ironically enough, he is kind of a last choice for John Adams there. Jay turned it down after being offered the position again in 1801. Marshall is really the last choice there. And by the end of his 34 years, I don't think you could really, you can no longer say that it was a body that was lacking in those 3 qualities that Jay mentioned there. And Marshall's court really maintained the court's authority and built upon it. He built the authority to settle contract disputes, expanding the jurisprudence in regards to issues such as paper money, and I should note the institution of slavery as well, which we'll delve on later in the program. The rights of free Black individuals will definitely come up a lot in Marshall's court. And, of course, an emerging national market and a national economy.
Yeah, so me personally, I've become pretty fond over the years of Kent Neumayer's biography on John Marshall. It's a really impressive biography, and although I don't agree with him 100% of the time on his interpretations of Marshall, I do think that he does a really good job of kind of succinctly summarizing the sort of legacy of Marshall and how he really innovated, not just the Supreme Court, but the judicial branch as a whole. And to kind of, reference your initial question is, how differently did the court function at the end of his career versus how it functions today? And I think that Kent Neumayer, he sums it up very nicely when he says, one only has to compare the effort of the Marshall Court to settle the aforementioned issues that Matthew is speaking about, contract disputes, national markets, slave cases. He says that you only have to compare those with the modern court, as they are asked to find authority for desegregation, abortion rights, gay rights, and equal voting rights in the 14th Amendment of 1868, which was designed primarily to grant a modicum of civil equality to newly freed slaves.
Hi, my name is Joe Grogan.
And I'm Eric Ulan for DCEKG.
DCEKG is all about the how and why of Washington, D.C., what's going on behind the headlines. We spend a lot of time talking about healthcare and economic policy, but frequently delve into trade policy and sometimes national security or whatever's happening on Capitol Hill.
Between Joe and I, we have nearly 5 decades of Washington experience. We put that to work with our guests to explain to you what's going on in Washington.
I always found myself calling Eric when I didn't understand what was happening, and always found him to be really good at explaining to me some of the things that I wasn't seeing, and I hope our guests will get the same type of insights.
I always found myself talking to Joe when I couldn't believe what I was seeing happening to understand exactly how the heck we got to where we were. Tune into DCEKG anywhere podcasts or YouTubes are available. You won't regret it.
Now, as far as Marshall's impact on the court during his time, I do again defer to Kent Neumayer. According to him, Marshall's greatest impact on the court was the consolidation of the power to interpret the Constitution. And that is the true meaning of judicial review. Again, one of those buzzwords that I'm sure we're going to talk about a little bit more here later on. But he's doing this at a time when it was possible to extract with a certain degree of precision exactly what the words of the Constitution meant. Marshall wasn't in the room when they were signing the Constitution, but he was there for Virginia's ratification debates. And he's the first person to really take up cases that ask, constitutional questions. What does this document mean? What impact does it have on the government? And how do we resolve these issues? And Marshall is able to do that over the course of his career, his very long career.
And I should also add that at the Virginia ratifying conventions of 1788, one of Marshall's big terms of defense that he would use to counter claims made by those like Patrick Henry and George Mason that the president would be too powerful, the Congress would be dictated too much by the passions of the people and would turn basically the country into a mobocracy.
Yeah.
And also, Patrick Henry and Mason had a lot of qualms with the opening lines of the Constitution, the preamble, "We the people." Henry was kind of offended by that. He would go, "What does that even mean? What does that phrase, 'we the people,' mean? Does that mean the states will just cease to exist? Will we just be dictated by whatever a majority of whoever has to say?" This was a serious matter of debate that really this entire convention hinged on. One of Marshall's key phrases that he used to defend against this attack was that there would be a strong independent judiciary to counter the other two branches of government. And it's ironic enough that that's part of the message that one could argue is what wins the convention. It's a vote of 89 to 79 in favor of ratification. And Virginia being the largest colony, the largest state during that time, it really would have greatly impacted American history had the vote gone the other way, and it almost did.
Yes, some historians have definitely argued, and I do think that there is an argument here, but that the legitimacy of the Constitution really hinges on Virginia's ratification of it, it being such a powerful state. And I have to bring this up just because Marshall brought up, Matthew here, he brought up Patrick Henry during the ratification debates. Patrick Henry's a really complicated, fascinating figure. You've delved into him yourself quite a few times on the podcast over the years. But Marshall advocates specifically for that principle of judicial review during those ratification debates before, this independent judiciary really even exists as an institution. Specifically, it's when Patrick Henry says that this Constitution that we are debating could be used to free slaves. And Marshall is actually the one who says, well, actually, it's an independent judiciary's role to ensure that that doesn't happen. They are there to strike down laws and declare them null and void if they do something as crazy as freeing Black people in the state.
And Marshall certainly would use that principle for that effect.
Oh, yeah, most definitely.
Absolutely. And we'll definitely be circling back around to that, but it's so fascinating. And I know for frequent listeners of the podcast, we've hit upon these points, not just with the first special episode on John Marshall. There's this clear thread throughout his life and career, these ideas that would, whenever he became Chief Justice, would become bedrocks of the American judiciary and our legal system. But then also this point at the Virginia Ratification Convention and just how close it came to not going through and not having the Constitution be ratified by this key state. And to have Marshall as a part of this and to know that he had this clear...
He had a vision.
Clear vision of how this could go. And it's just, it's so fascinating. I think that's one thing that surprises listeners. And I've heard folks talk about this before, the fact that the court before Marshall, you could have not one, but two chief justices travel to Europe to do diplomacy because they had so little to do. And to see in his 34 years how this completely reshaped but it didn't have to be that way. It didn't have to be that the federal Constitution, that federal law superseded state law. And the fact that he had such a role in that was just really fascinating.
Yeah. And I also want to throw in there that depending on who you ask, there are some historians that say that Virginia was, I don't think that they really make this argument anymore, but they do say that Virginia was the final state to ratify the Constitution, sending it into effect. I think that the actual answer to that is that it was Vermont and that Virginia follows shortly after that. But Virginia itself wasn't aware that Vermont had ratified it. So
I think what they say is it was New Hampshire that was the ninth state.
Excuse me. Yeah, that sounds right.
They both look the same on the map. So
it's
fine. But New Hampshire, I think, votes for confirmation just like less than a week before Virginia does. But because of how slow news travels, I mean, Virginia really does get the center of all that attention.
Yeah. Well, and I remember from the second pre-presidency episode for Madison sent an express rider to Alexander Hamilton to let him know, oh, it's done. We ratified the Constitution. It's going into effect. And then he got word, no, New Hampshire beat Virginia. But it still does, if Virginia hadn't joined, what would that mean? And especially considering that North Carolina, my home state, didn't ratify until after George Washington became president. What would that have meant? Would North Carolina have not ratified eventually? What would it have meant? We don't know. But the fact that he had that role in that was it's really fascinating. And, I think as we go along, we'll see a bit more of that. But to turn to more of a personal note for a moment, because one of the things with presidencies that we like to do is really understand that these are people with lives of their own, as well as being these monumental figures in American history. So would y'all mind telling us what was life like for the Marshall family while John served as Chief Justice? Did his family accompany him while he traveled for court work, or did they remain in Richmond?
So unfortunately, this is an area where we have very scant information, but we know that Polly did travel with John to Philadelphia on some occasions.
Polly being his wife.
Polly being John Marshall's wife. They were married in 1783. They moved to Richmond very shortly after that. Marshall continues a law practice in Richmond that really prompts the move to that city and the construction of his home there that we work at today. We know that she gives birth to one of their children there in Philadelphia when Marshall is serving as a congressman. So it's either in 1798 or 1799 during that period. We know that Marshall mentions an overseer in a letter to Polly, and usually in letters she is written to as though she's the one running the household and making decisions, which kind of leads us to make an assumption there that she's going to be at home a large period of these times. She's probably going to remain in Richmond. Her health was definitely in a very precarious state throughout the 1790s going into the early 1800s, and that's of course, what's very common during this period is just the toll, both physically and mentally, that childbirth has on a mother and as a wife during this period here. So we see around 1803, just a couple years after Marshall joins the court, her health really begins to decline. So her traveling will definitely become much less frequent than whatever levels it was before that. She's largely going to stay in Richmond, staying with her parents, the Amblers, both Jacqueline and Rebecca Burwell Ambler. They would be living there in Richmond during this time. So this is really where she's going to remain, either that or their Oak Hill estate that's up in Fauquier County for a large part of the last 20 years or so of her life. But we do know that by 1801, as for the children in this regard, most of Marshall's children would have been born by this time. The oldest, Thomas, was born in 1784, so he's about in his late teens during this time. He would have been finishing his studies at Princeton College during this time. And his other children, they would come to maturity and receive their education along this time that their father is serving as Chief Justice early in his tenure. But as to the details of their education, as to the details of where they would have been traveling to, how frequently they came to Washington, D.C. to visit their father while he's serving on the bench, we just can't really answer that with any definitive assurance.
A little note on their education, though. Our best assumptions can be made. We do know a fair amount about John Marshall's education. He is largely educated on what was then the frontier of Virginia in modern-day Fauquier County at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And we do know that there are certain things that were valued in his education. Obviously, reading and writing, they studied a lot of English literature. Alexander Pope's poetry and his essays on morals were really important, so I can only imagine that his children are also reading those. And they do learn how to speak foreign languages. John Marshall would learn how to speak French. The girls, they do learn how to play instruments. In fact, at the house, we actually have a harp that belonged to one of John Marshall's sisters, Elizabeth, whom they called Liza. So, knowing what we know about John Marshall's education, we can only assume that was actually probably expanded on a bit for his children. And, a lot of them go on to, have pretty prominent careers. The eldest son, Thomas Marshall, he would run for public office in Virginia and win. We know that one of his sons becomes a doctor. They become attorneys, things like that. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Matthew.
No, you're fine. Yeah, so we do know basically, as Ben said, that whatever education the children would have, it would have been substantially more than what John Marshall has. But because John Marshall's the one who so many remember for his primary role, we tend to know more about his youth experience. And what's kind of interesting about his youth, if I can kind of go on a tangent about that a little bit, is
absolutely
a lot of the stories that go into Marshall's youth kind of correlate with that frontier, rural upbringing. Like imagine all the stories around Abraham Lincoln's upbringing, or somebody like Daniel Boone. You almost get kind of Daniel Boone vibes when you read about John Marshall's early years. And I think it's very interesting. He'd grow up basically in a one-room log cabin before moving to a house that still stands today called the Hollow House. That's up in Fauquier County near his Oak Hill estate, near his place of birth too.
And there's an active preservation project to preserve that historic site as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't look so great right now, but hopefully someday.
Yeah, absolutely. But Marshall basically is the first of 15 children that come to Thomas Marshall, who's a local land surveyor and a close, I would say probably not in childhood, but in early adulthood, he becomes associated with George Washington through their surveying duties, as well as Mary Randolph Keith Marshall, who is through that prominent Randolph family that others like Thomas Jefferson, John Randolph of Roanoke, who I've heard come up very frequently in your narrative. They are all cousins of John Marshall's. And I think that's fascinating because Marshall is so radically different from those other members of his family. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that he doesn't have that mainly aristocratic upbringing.
Yeah.
Like those like Jefferson and John Randolph have, and other people like Edmund Randolph. They all grow up on plantations.
Yeah.
They get large amounts of money that's through large amounts of enslaved labor as well. And John Marshall, in this regard, he's definitely growing up surrounded by slavery, but definitely a smaller amount than what he will himself purchase and acquire over his years.
Yeah, and it probably should be noted that his upbringing is definitely still, I'd say objectively better than the average person's. Yeah. His family does have access to the Fairfax Library, but it is definitely, it's not a very say Jeffersonian or even Washington-esque upbringing. It is a little bit different. Then eventually he does kind of marry into that aristocracy. He marries into the Ambler household, which is a very prominent Tidewater aristocratic family.
Well, and it's fascinating because, and I think y'all get to a point that, maybe this was part of the reason why Marshall was so different, was kind of his upbringing and his start in these, different environment than some of these other figures who were still a part of the same family. But, and I did read, if I'm remembering correctly, that it was his grandmother on his mother's side who was just kind of shunned from the Randolph family. And that was part of the reason why they went to more of the wilderness setting.
Yeah. Her name is escaping me, but if I remember correctly, it was believed, or maybe it was true, that she had some kind of extramarital affair, which is just, for a Randolph, that's a huge faux pas right there. And that, definitely affects the family dynamic for generations, it appears.
Oh, if I can interject for a minute, I think her name was Mary Isham.
Yes.
Mary Isham.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a bizarre story that comes out of that story. Essentially, the family concocts this theory, according to some, that the man had left her, the man had abandoned her. And then eventually a story would come up that their child would be found dead on an island in the James River. And I don't really know all the details about this.
This is the first time I'm hearing this. I didn't even know about this.
I think it's in Gene Edward Smith.
You know what? Never mind. I have read about this before.
I don't know what the authority on this story is.
Yeah, I think that this mostly comes from sort of oral history, family tradition stuff, which is very difficult to nail down. But I actually do remember Gene Edward Smith mentioning this, and he doesn't cite a whole lot of sources when he talks about it.
Yeah, so I don't know how much authority that could bring on, but I think it's very interesting nonetheless.
It's definitely it's definitely interesting to consider it.
Absolutely, and the Randolph family in general is good for good stories,
Oh,
whether they're actually true or not.
Yeah.
Well, and as y'all mentioned, we've kind of touched upon this numerous times, and just like other members of the Randolph family as well, Marshall was a slave owner. Slavery was a part of his life from an early age. And so as he grew to more prominence and made the move to Richmond, and y'all already mentioned that between 8 and 16 individuals were enslaved at the site of the John Marshall House during his life. Would y'all mind sharing what do we know about these individuals and their lives, and what work has been done at the house to explore and share information about them?
So this is the portion of the podcast where we definitely have to give a proper shout out to two, one former educator and one current educator at the John Marshall House, Lydia Nuroff. She was with us for a short time, and she has since gone on to become the project manager for Virginia Untold with the Library of Virginia. But alongside her, Emma Clark, still currently working with us as museum educators. They have really dedicated themselves to researching the enslaved history, not only on the property, but across all of Virginia as it pertained to the Marshall family. And they have really left no stone unturned. Research and interpretation is definitely a communal and ongoing effort, but these two talented women that I look up to quite a bit myself, they've both done an extraordinary amount of legwork sifting through the Marshall Papers specifically, as well as numerous other sources to find every mention of enslaved individuals and compile what sources we have that tell us about these individuals' lives. And these individuals and their narratives, they make their way into every tour, program, lecture, other form of historic interpretation that we produce for the public. But that said, to answer your question, we do have some pretty interesting details about a handful of individuals, and we kind of just picked a few that we'd like to share with you guys about. One of the most prominent figures at the John Marshall House would have been Robin Spurlock. We call him Robin Spurlock. He's never actually referred to as Spurlock in any documentation that we see, but we do know that one of his daughters does take on the name Spurlock later on. Robin Spurlock served as John Marshall's body servant, his valet, and his butler. He is believed to have served as some sort of an administrative center on the property. So he did have a sort of heightened status over the other enslaved people on the property. And because of that, his life was a little bit different than the others. For example, we know that he has a family. His family is never broken up, which is a practice that's not only common in American slavery, but it's a practice that John Marshall himself engages in. He breaks up enslaved families and sends them to different places. There is also a oral tradition, I guess, that has somehow survived the test of time that says that Robin didn't even live on the property. He lived in a separate house in a neighborhood called Jackson Ward, not too far from the site of the John Marshall House. We haven't found any documentation that really supports that, but it is something that's, for whatever reason, that story has permeated its way through the generations of people who interpret at the John Marshall House. Additionally, though, Robin Spurlock, I mentioned he does have a family. He has a son, Robin Jr. He has a daughter, Agnes. We do know that Agnes would have served as an enslaved nursemaid on the property. Nursemaids are, to put it broadly, they're responsible for childcare. Of course, childcare, especially when you have young children, is kind of a 24/7 job. So enslaved wet nurses and enslaved nursemaids, they probably would have been sleeping in the house, probably on the landings at the top of the stairs. The other enslaved people would have been living in the various outbuildings on the property. So they had a laundry, a kitchen. They probably slept in lofts above their workspaces that they were attached to. Henry, he was responsible for running the kitchen. John Marshall does have a kitchen on the property right behind his house. We don't have any physical evidence for the kitchen. We have documents, though, that show, so we have like insurance and tax documents that show that there was a stable, a laundry, a law office, a smokehouse, and of course that kitchen that Henry would have been responsible for running and preparing the meals for not only the Marshall family, but all of their guests. We know that the Marshall family very frequently entertains at the house. There is one individual that I wanted to bring up because he has actually sort of beaten Matthew and I onto the Presidency's podcast. It was actually just yesterday. I was listening again to your Marbury versus Madison episode, and you open up the episode reading a letter that John Marshall sends from Raleigh when he's on riding circuit about how he didn't have his pants with him. Well, in that letter, I don't know if it was quoted directly on the podcast, but in that letter, it is made clear that this enslaved man by the name of Peter did travel with John Marshall. So if he traveled that one time, we can only assume he probably traveled other times as well. But he was the one that was responsible for packing the Chief Justice's clothes, and apparently he forgot his pants, and that put Marshall in a bind. He was in a lot of trouble trying to find himself a pair of suitable pants. So Peter, at least indirectly, he was on the Presidency's podcast before anybody else from the John Marshall house was. Jim Actor is an interesting figure that I've been pretty fascinated by lately. The sources for Jim are, we'll say, dicey. The most important mention that we have of him comes from a 1901 Richmond Dispatch article that says that this man by the name of Jim Actor was John Marshall's body servant before Robin was, and that Robin somehow beat him out for the job. Like, he did a better job, and Jim Actor was relegated to no longer being the Chief Justice's body servant. The source on that does come from 1900, and we think it's descendants that probably tell us about that source. So some of the more intricate details of Jim Actor, we don't know how much we could trust those. Other than that, it seems like he probably did exist. And then Israel is a really fascinating figure as well, and the last one that I'll bring up here. John Marshall engages in a pretty common practice. This is particularly common in urban settings, where the enslaver will essentially rent out the labor of those that they enslave to other places. Israel, he was frequently sent out to the coal mines in Midlothian. Midlothian is around Richmond. They're not known for coal production to this day, but they were during John Marshall's lifetime. Israel was frequently sent out to these coal mines. Now, Israel is really fascinating because we know that he self-emancipates a number of times. He runs away. And we actually have multiple articles that Marshall takes out in newspapers with a reward seeking Israel's return. I don't know if he ultimately does, permanently get away, but we do know that he engages in that practice of self-emancipation a number of times. Matthew, did you have anything that you wanted to add there in terms of individuals on the property?
Well, there is nothing I could really mention anymore about some of the people who would have been there. But as for our research processes a little bit more, there is, of course, the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, which is to be determined when it's going to be published, but it's currently under review. And this is kind of something that we've been considering through Preservation Virginia.
And that's the enslaved.org project, correct?
Yes. And having our own version of enslaved.org, which is where Emma and Lydia put so much of these documents under. So this is all public information. Anybody who is interested can search for these people's names, can search for anybody who's affiliated with John Marshall and learn more about them. So when that is published, it will be on our website at preservationvirginia.org. But there are varying amounts of information. We have 64 named individuals out of the 250 to 300. So unfortunately, that leaves so many who are forgotten in American history. And even with those that we do mention, sometimes the mention of their names could be the only time that these people are really remembered. But we believe his holdings came close to 300, if not 350, based on tax records that he had in Richmond, Henrico, and Fauquier counties.
Yeah, it should be noted that John Marshall, by the end of his life, he owns about 150,000 acres of land, which is a pretty unthinkable amount of land. And a lot of those properties are developed. There are structures, there are production things happening on those various properties. So there would have been a lot of enslaved individuals living and laboring on those various properties.
And other names, like the ones that Ben already mentioned, they're names that come up more frequently, especially in our tours and our programs that we do. But others like Hannibal, that's a name that we only see mentioned once, and that's when he's purchased by Marshall in 1789. Of course, that leads others to kind of be more well-remembered than others. And Robin Spurlock is probably the one who comes up the most frequently in Marshall biographies. And sometimes that's kind of for ulterior reasons, to kind of paint Marshall in a light of being a person who was not as harsh of a slave owner as others, because he offers Robin his freedom. But there's a problem with that narrative when it comes down to when looking at the actual codicil in the will. And that's something that we fortunately have possession of in our archives and our documents. And that shows 3 choices that are given forward to Robin in this process here. The first choice is for Robin to take $50 and be provided passage to a northern state where he'd live out the remainder of his days as a free man. The second choice being to take $100 and provide passage overseas to the colony of Liberia on the western shore of Africa. Now, Marshall and his involvement with the American Colonization Society could probably have a whole episode onto itself.
Yeah.
But to basically sum it up, he was president of the Richmond branch of the ACS. And actually, one of his close colleagues, Bushrod Washington, President Washington's nephew and fellow Supreme Court justices, he was president of the nationwide branch around this very time. So that will kind of tie into our conversation later, that when we talk about Marshall's involvement and the court's role in the institution of slavery, because there's definitely a vested interest in slave owners like Marshall for colonization. And it's not out of the most pleasant of motives, I should say. Marshall is definitely quoted as saying, and Paul Finkelman cites this in his book, Supreme Injustice, Marshall is quoted as saying in his ACS meetings that the freed black population of Richmond poses a threat because they are full of, quote, pests and criminals.
Yeah.
Now, what does that say to the freed black people, about the freed black people of that town? Well, that would project a negative image. But if you look at the records of these individuals during this time, they're actually very successful businessmen. They're starting their own careers. They're starting their own entrepreneurships, their own trades. And this is leading to a large amount of success and probably competition with white merchants and white townspeople here in Richmond. And that's probably where so much of this angst really comes from. And Marshall and other friends of his who work on the General Assembly, they're going to really be incensed by this. And of course, we don't know if that's what Marshall feels explicitly, but we can kind of assume that based on the moods and temperaments of his colleagues. And we don't really see Marshall openly speaking out against these feelings. We can only assume that he's working in tacit agreement with them. So that leads the General Assembly after Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800, which actually his close friend James Monroe is serving as governor of Virginia during that time. So one cannot really imagine them thinking too differently on this issue here. If you're a Virginia slave owner, your interest is going to be one and the same, whether you're a Federalist or a Democratic Republican. So essentially, the General Assembly, a few years after this, passes a law in the General Assembly that says that anyone who is freed by their owner has to leave the state within 12 months. And if they refuse to do this, if they don't comply, or if they fail to meet the deadline, they are essentially subjecting themselves up to capture and re-enslavement to a different owner in a different locality. That could be in Virginia, that could be further south. So that is pretty much a threat to the free black community here, and that leads to so much regression of that progress that has been made. But that's specifically a signal to Robin when he's looking at this in the will in 1835. After Marshall's already passed away, we know because of his duties as a butler and valet, he had been assorting through Marshall's correspondence, reading his mail. So we definitely know that he knew how to read and write because of this. But Robin here, essentially when looking over this will, he knows that he has to leave Virginia if he takes freedom. That's just what the law in the state says at the time. But we've already mentioned that he has a family here, and it's also worth mentioning he's been that butler for over 50 years. So he's definitely not a young man anymore.
He's very much a member of the Richmond, not only enslaved community, but the free black community as well.
Yeah, he's well respected within that community. He probably has close friendships and alliances with many of these prominent individuals, which leads to some kind of conspiracy theory mongering among the upper white class like Marshall, who probably suspect, and Monroe suspects this as well, and I think there's actually letters to Jefferson talking about this, where he essentially says that the free black community was working in conjunction with Gabriel to help plot this rebellion. So that's kind of this conspiratorial mindset that many like Marshall are going to have that lead to the advancement of these laws. So it's a really convoluted puzzle here, but when you really see here just the effect that this would have on Robin and his family, and I don't like using the word forced on tours, but I think people can kind of put two and two together and see that this is very coercive language that comes out of this will. Robin Marshall being Chief Justice for 34 years. If anybody knows the law, it's John Marshall. If anybody knows the law surrounding slavery, it's John Marshall. And he had any opportunity to go into a courthouse. He could have donned his black Supreme Court robes to really get the effect in there that this is serious and say, look, my entrusted servant, Robin, these are his papers. I want him to be freed when I die. Can you arrange this for me?
Yeah. Well, and he also was the one that was overseeing the federal circuit in Richmond. So he himself probably could have signed off on Robin's freedom if he truly wanted that to happen.
And that's a good point as well.
And it should also be noted that in his will, Marshall doesn't mention any of Robin's family members, and we know that they exist, and we're pretty sure that they're in Richmond. So even if he did have some desire to resettle elsewhere, his family's not coming with him.
Yeah. So it puts him in a position where he has to choose between his own freedom and his family.
And some Marshall biographers have attempted to kind of retrofit John Marshall and look at this will and say, he had this really, friendly, soft relationship with Robin, but, with proper historical examination, that you can't use this will to say that. And not to mention there are, so many other individuals that are enslaved to him and his family. None of them get offered any kind of choices in his will.
Yeah.
In fact, he breaks up enslaved families with his will a couple times, or there's a couple different iterations of it where he does that, which is just terrible to think about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and on the podcast, we come back to this point time and again, because at this time, and especially in those presidencies, with so many of the Virginia presidents, with so many prominent Virginians in high places in the federal government, we come back to these folks time and again. We had the episode on Gabriel's Rebellion, and in the narrative, we've been seeing increasingly this discomfort within that white planter class in Virginia with the Haitian Revolution and with increased slave rebellions. And then we get to Jefferson and the episode that we did on the Hemings family, and why Sally Hemings was never emancipated, was technically still enslaved to her last day, but was given her time, which is the informal way of allowing her to live as if she was a free woman in Charlottesville, but she couldn't actually be free. And you get to those points, that this was such a complex system, and that there were some ways to kind of get around it. And especially for people as prominent and in the federal judiciary as John Marshall. And I think that's a very important point to note here. He really could have done more. He didn't.
Yeah, exactly. And I wanted to add on to your point, specifically about Sally Hemings being, quote, given her time. Virginia law, at least in 1835, when Marshall passes away, manumission law is really strict. And Matthew already mentioned this. If an enslaved person is manumitted, then they have 12 months to either petition a lower court, or I think it's the state legislature to approve of their status as a free person. That's the way the Virginia law reads. And there's a lot of active research being done, not only by us, but other people as well, that seems to be finding that it was just really, that it was almost more common, like you said, for them to kind of exist in this gray area. They're given their time, but they don't seek that legal status as a free Black person. Just because the number of hoops one would have to jump through, presumably a person that has very little resources as well in order to obtain that free status.
Absolutely.
And you do, the system, and we've kind of talked about this in various episodes, and we're actually going to talk about this with Dolly Madison as well. I've got some episodes coming out. I think it's going to be around the same time as this one on her life. And, in her early days, you have this temporary loosening of Virginia law, which allowed for manumission that was a bit easier because at that time it was thought that slavery was not profitable. And then you have the cotton gin, you've got Gabriel's Rebellion, you've got the Haitian Revolution. You see this tightening of the laws and all these laws being set up to discourage emancipating individuals, discouraging free blacks from being in Virginia, and this very inequitable system being built, and that continues on to the present day. This inequity, and
you have continued investment from people like Marshall in the ACS to answer that question about, what do we do with these free black people?
Absolutely. And you see in the business dealings and in the way the system was being set up for individuals like Marshall to profit from enslaved labor, you see the reason why some of this is coming into play, because, John Marshall, as y'all mentioned, he owned this 150,000 acres of land. He used this for his personal wealth. So he had a personal interest in supporting the slave system, the enslavement of individuals. And so I was wondering if y'all would take a moment to talk about, with these 350 individuals that he had over numerous properties, what business ventures was Marshall engaged in during this portion of his career? How did these individuals tie into his personal wealth and the wealth and the economic status of the Marshall family?
Yeah, so given Marshall's prolific investment in not only the institution of slavery, but the slave trade as well, the slave markets in Shockoe Bottom of Richmond are the second largest in the world, second to New Orleans. So given his prolific investment in the institution, it really is hard to isolate any portion of Marshall's career, whether that be his public and political life, his personal business ventures, or even his philanthropic pursuits, as not being inherently intertwined with his investment in human capital. An example of that could be John Marshall's rural property that he owned along the Chickahominy River that Marshall occasionally used as a retreat, and was noted for its production of hogs. Marshall, in fact, had a smokehouse on his Richmond property where he presumably smoked a fair amount of pork from this property. It's our understanding that this property was not an insignificant source of income for Marshall, and it is believed that there would have been a large number of enslaved men and women living and laboring there. I think Paul Finkelman estimates there might have been anywhere from 50 to 75 at any given time. Even when seemingly uncontroversial portions of Marshall's life are discussed, take perhaps his involvement in starting one of Richmond's first volunteer fire departments. It is difficult for one to not see at least a portion of the funds that are allowing Marshall to be a part of an objectively good endeavor. Fire departments are great. We all love our fire departments. It's hard to not view that as being, inherently attached, either directly or indirectly to human chattel.
And we also know that Marshall purchased, sold, and hired out enslaved people very frequently throughout this time in his life. We already mentioned Israel, who was lent out to the Midlothian mines. Which I should mention today is actually open to the public as a park in Chesterfield County. So you can actually see perhaps some of the places where Israel would have actually been working, which I think is phenomenal to actually be able to see that.
Yeah.
And kind of to go into another example of this practice that Marshall took part in 1784, just as a young upstarting attorney in Richmond, he's not even 30 years old yet, we see Moses is lent out to a Mr. Lewis. And we know that Israel is sold to a Mr. Moses Austin, that worker of the coal mine. And Dicey and her child are bought by Marshall on July 4th, 1787, by John Johnston, and then is sold to Jacqueline Ambler, Polly's father. So we see a family connection coming into this as well. The labor is shared among family. It's shared among individuals who work with John Marshall, who have personal correspondences with him. And the last thing that I can really safely tell you is that a Mr. George Webb Jr. and Mr. Charles Min Thurston both either sold or lent Marshall at least 16 enslaved individuals over a course of a given period. And it's difficult to really ascertain what business they were lent for, how much Marshall profited from it, if he profited from it at all. It's possible he could have been serving as a manager for these enslaved people, so just holding them for somebody else. but he definitely has at least some financial investment in this institution that goes outside of his own personal slave ownership. That much is absolutely clear.
Well, and y'all bring up so many points that, are important to understand about the intricacies of enslavement and the Southern economy. And it's just, it is, and especially like it ties into everything. It ties into the political system. It ties into the social system. It ties into families. We've seen that now with James Madison and everything happening in Orange County and the relations in the Madison family in that area. And it's just such an intricate system. And I greatly appreciate y'all sharing this and sharing and the work that's being done at the John Marshall House and in Virginia in general to help us to understand. And, one of the points that I think you brought up and that we touched on with the Hemmings family episode is that, the enslaved people in the domestic settings are generally the ones that we can find out more information about, because you get their mentions in personal letters. You get more of this interaction between the white planter family and those that are enslaved. But it's important to note all of the other individuals, even though we may not know their names, to know that they were there and that they played a role in this economic system that benefited the Marshall family and others like them. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. And so turning back to his judicial career, in terms of the precedents set during the Marshall Court, particularly with the institutionalization of concepts such as judicial review and the supremacy of federal law and the federal constitution over state law and state constitutions, we've touched on this a little bit already, but do you see Marshall as being revolutionary in his judicial philosophy and interpretation, or was he part of a growing trend in judicial circles?
Now, this is something I actually think that Ben and I have some disagreement on. So this could lead to an interesting conversation.
We're going to fight right here on the podcast.
You're ready for it, audience. Come on.
But as for me, I would go as far to say he was revolutionary to a certain extent. Marshall definitely would get a lot of his philosophy from others, and Ben will delve more deeply into those individuals in a minute, so I'll leave that to him to describe. But as for me, what makes Marshall so revolutionary is he takes philosophies, he takes ideals that have only been used in a localized environment, that have only been used in state courts, in local courts, during the time that America was colonies, and also used in British courts across the seas. But these are only done in localities. At the most, like town ordinances get overruled by the local court in the town. It's nothing like big and high stakes like we see with Marbury versus Madison. And one would argue that case really wasn't as definitive or as transformational as we acknowledge it as today. In that time, it was just a conversation about whether someone could get a commission. But in the long scope, we really start to see this get turned around into a larger ideal of judicial principles. What is the role the Supreme Court is going to play in the years to come? The first three Chief Justices, John Jay, John Rutledge, and Oliver Ellsworth, failed to really make a lasting impact on the court because they were not willing to take the court outside of its very limited capacity that it had been originally granted to it. And what makes Marshall's tenure so remarkable is that right off the bat, the first major case that comes to him, 1803, that case of Marbury versus Madison, he sets forth those principles of judicial review and removes them from just the state and local localities that it had remained in and brings it to the national level to a scale really never seen in any country up to that time. So what Marshall does in this instance here is he lays the groundwork for a strong construction of judicial powers and builds upon that to allow the Supreme Court to rule in favor of a stronger national government. He codifies Hamilton's financial plans into federal law by essentially, in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, by essentially laying down that, yes, Congress and Congress alone has that ability to create a national bank. A couple years later, in Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824, he opens the gateways for huge financial growth, huge economic and trade growth for the nation at large by saying that only the federal government, only Congress, not the individual states, have the power to regulate commerce. And at the same time, he defines commerce as being anything that moves between state lines. So that is a very broad definition, right? So that essentially leaves here a vast array of interpretations that could come down in the years to come. We especially see this come up during the Warren Court years in the 1950s, in the age of desegregation. We see this during the civil rights policies that are taken up by the Kennedy and Johnson administrations in the 1960s. They really take up, the charge of, hey, these individuals have gotten on these buses. They've crossed across our interstate highway system. That's another, matter of interstate commerce, right? And these people have been attacked in southern states. These buses get firebombed and attacked by segregationists. So what does that lead to? That gives grounding now for the federal government to step in and protect these individuals. Because commerce, under Marshall's broad interpretation from so many years before, is not just goods. It's not just crates of wheat and barley and supplies that are needed for next year's crops. It is also people. And that also has a negative connotation with that as well, because think of the lifetime that Marshall's living in. If you're interpreting that to mean that could include people, well, what does that tell to Virginians like John Randolph of Roanoke under matters concerning slavery and the moving of enslaved people across state lines? If Congress can regulate interstate commerce, does that mean Congress can step in to regulate slavery and stop its spread in that regard there? And I know we've already delved into this, and some of the listeners could be scratching their heads thinking, wait, if Marshall's such a prolific slave owner, how could he be making policies that curtail slavery? And that's just the thing. He never does. But this is part of the, I like to say, conspiracy mindset that really pervades many people in the South starting around this time period. And that leads to concepts such as nullification and of federal laws, which I should mention starts with Marshall's not so good friend Jefferson and continues on, gets really taken up by John C. Calhoun in the years to come, and ends up being the entire impetus for the Civil War because they secede from the Union as a result of Lincoln's election. All of this feeds into, again, and there were cries of secession in the wake of Gibbons versus Ogden, which, of course, many people reading Gibbons versus Ogden today would probably be falling asleep because it's just about steamboat rights and breaking up a state monopoly on the manufacture of steamboats. How could this be anything of importance during this period, right? But it really goes to show, at least in my view, Ben might disagree here, but the radicalism of Marshall's judicial philosophies in this regard here. He takes something that has no power, next to no power, and gives it something that puts it at a co-equal level with both the executive and to Congress. And when we talk a little bit more about, especially his relationships with those branches of government, we'll see how that comes into play a little bit further. But I'd like to really emphasize there, Marshall is the man who, even though he was the fourth Chief Justice, I'd say he's the man who makes the court really
gives it the energy, the dignity, and the weight, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. The things that John Jay was so angry about it not being there. I think Jay was probably kicking himself a little bit, wishing he had come back, seeing what Marshall had done to make that court so lively and full of energy there. But that's what I would consider to be the key takeaway of Marshall's court years.
Yeah, so I think the thing that Matthew and I probably disagree on the most is what a judicial philosophy is. When Matthew brings up cases like McCulloch v. Maryland or Gibbons v. Ogden, I view the ideas set forth by the court as being more so political philosophies than they are judicial philosophies. And usually when I talk about those cases, I let people know, the questions that the court is asking there are just the classic questions of federalism versus anti-federalism. And we know that John Marshall is very much a federalist. But that said, to kind of go back to your original question of whether or not, I see him as being revolutionary in his judicial philosophies, I don't. And this is admittedly one of those topics where there is definitely scholarly debate. And no matter what I say, people are going to viscerally disagree with me. But that said, I don't see his judicial philosophy as being very revolutionary. I also don't think it would be fair to say that he was part of a growing trend, however, but the seed had definitely been planted by others. Marshall is, of course, a product of a generation of attorneys trained by George Wythe out of the University of William and Mary. And although his stint in Wythe's lecture hall was definitely brief, like a few months, many others were. Wythe's ideals are definitely visible in Marshall's career, I think. One of the biggest innovations Wythe was responsible for was instilling the value within his students that although they were only in his classes for a time, they would forever be students of the law. Law was and is an ever-changing, fluid, and adaptable endeavor, and the greatest legal minds would always be privy to this, learning as they went. Over the course of Marshall's career, we see the ways in which he is capable of having a changing and ever-dynamic opinion on legal issues. One of the best examples of this, for me personally, is, and I know we're going to talk about these a little bit more later on, but those are the cases dealing with Marshall's views on native sovereignty. So Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, Worcester v. Georgia. One of the most fascinating things about these cases for me personally is that over the course of a decade, we see Marshall refer to the issues of native sovereignty only within the context of land exchanges between Anglo-Americans to vehemently defending the right to sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation, a group that in his own legal decisions, he once lumped into a category he called Indian savages. Personally, I don't see a world where that evolution takes place. I don't see a world where something like that happens without Withian principles being ever present in the nation's highest court. Of course, George Wythe himself can't be solely credited with these things either. He himself was heavily influenced by William Blackstone, particularly in his structural approach to teaching law. And to kind of circle all the way back to your initial question, I don't think that there is enough there to call all of this a growing trend. But I do feel that it might be accurate to say Marshall was at an apex of American history where he learned from the right people at the right time and was, as Matthew very succinctly pointed out, he was bold enough to bring those philosophies to the court.
Now, I will actually agree with Ben in part. I think Marshall was a better politician than he was a jurist. I will definitely say that. I think Ben has convinced me in that regard, at least.
Yeah.
Marshall was definitely a disciple of Hamilton, of Washington, of Adams. He followed a lot along with their political principles, and he carried that with him. And I think he, very correctly so, viewed the court as the last means of preserving that ideal. And he would definitely use opportunities like Marbury, McCulloch, and Gibbons, the cases that we, I think, reasonably enough called the big three cases for a reason. They're the cases where he really brings those principles, those Federalist political principles, and mixes them with judicial ideas that he learned from George Wythe and others.
And Adams puts him on the court for that purpose directly. He's trying to maintain some semblance of federalism within this, this incoming very anti-federalist administration in the Jefferson administration.
Yep, just around the same time as there was something that a phrase that might be familiar to modern listeners of the pod, something called court packing.
Yeah.
This would probably ring some bells there. But John Adams, appoints Marshall Chief Justice less than a month before he's set to leave office, just at the same time that the Federalist lame duck Senate is on their way out the door, and they pass the Judiciary Act of 1801 that says that we're going to double the size of the district courts, we're going to double the size of the circuit courts, and add up to upwards of 15 new Federalist judges.
I think it's closer to 40.
Closer to 40?
I think it's closer to 40. Yeah, these are the midnight appointments that are made by the Adams administration on their way out. And it really was just a last ditch effort. In what areas of government is federalism really not, at the fore? And that was in the judicial system.
Yeah.
And they capitalized on the opportunity to expand it and fill it with all these Federalists.
Yeah, and a lot of those positions would also be lower positions like Justices of the Peace, which would go to William and Marbury. Mm-hmm. And that's what opens the gate up for that very dramatic case that we see there.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. So listeners who have already listened to the first John Marshall episode, when we discussed his leaving the Secretary of State position and becoming Chief Justice, we understand that this was, and that's something that I think folks may struggle with a little bit about this period in the early Republic's history, that the judiciary was very political. Even rulings from the bench at that time, it was politically motivated, but definitely with Marshall's appointment as Chief Justice, it was solely because Adams couldn't trust that if he tried to appoint somebody who wasn't right there in DC and willing to say, okay, I'll do it and take the office, he may lose it, and Jefferson would be the one appointing the Chief Justice, and that would have ramifications across the federal judiciary. And so, I think it's very important to tie in that political philosophy to all of this. And I think y'all also make a good point. And one of the things that comes up in so much other scholarship around the Revolution and the early Republic and some of these founding documents, even the Declaration of Independence, you've got folks who, was that really original for Jefferson, or is it more of these political philosophies that he was exposed to and that he put into this work? And it ultimately gets to that these people, just like us, aren't operating in a vacuum. They have influences, they have experiences, even if it's just, a few weeks in George Wyth's lecture, it still has this major impact on somebody. But it also, I think there is something to be said about what the individual does with it. And I think that y'all pointed out that Marshall being there, he was the fourth Chief Justice. The other three hadn't, for whatever reason, done anything like he ultimately did with the court. And so there was something about John Marshall being in that position that was important, but he brought so much with him that, and political philosophy, as well as, a judicial view that really helped him to have this impact. And that was, one of the interesting things about the Marshall Court is that there were so few dissenting opinions in the court. But one notable exception that we've already mentioned by name, being Cherokee Nation v. the state of Georgia. So would y'all mind sharing why it was that there are so few dissenting opinions and what influence Marshall had on how opinions were handed down by the court during his tenure as Chief Justice?
Yeah, so, when Marshall enters into the Supreme Court, John Jay being his only, the only Chief Justice before him that actually issued decisions, the court was often issuing individual opinions. Like, multiple justices would write multiple opinions, and they were all more or less kind of, they held the same amount of weight. But, John Marshall enters into the Supreme Court and he starts, what's now largely tradition, and that is the court issuing one definitive opinion, that is the de facto ruling. Of course, concurring opinions exist, and people can dissent in full or in part, but largely the court is issuing a single opinion. Now, as to why that is, I can only imagine that being the guy on the court who says, actually, we're going to start taking up really controversial cases about, emerging national markets, the role of a federal bank and federal bureaucracy in everyday life. Being the first person to really envision that role of the court in these cases, I can only imagine that carries so much weight in having people, for the most part, signing on to your opinions. I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add to that, Matthew.
I think it's truly remarkable how many unanimous decisions the Marshall Court is able to produce. And that's really through the process of moderation and compromise. And that's a principle that we hardly ever hear in relation to the Supreme Court nowadays. But when it comes down to the Marshall Court, I think in 1 year, out of 42 opinions that were issued, 41 were unanimous. All but one were unanimous decisions that the court hands down there. And that really speaks to really the talents that John Marshall has. Again, part of those political talents and those ideals that he'll bring with him to the court. Another part of the reason why I think he's a better politician than he is a jurist, because he's able to whittle down to the basic principles of a case and basically asked, do you agree with this or disagree with this? And if not, what are some things we can do so that each of us gets at least part of what we want out of this case, while still having the overarching message of the case really come down to these simple questions? And that's why in cases like McCulloch v. Maryland, when you think of the issue of a national bank and the debate surrounding that during this period in time, you imagine Jefferson in a really heated argument with Alexander Hamilton. Well, Jefferson becomes president and he appoints a lot of political partisans, you could argue, people who are Democratic Republicans, objectively so. He appoints them to Marshall's court. And this is all with the understanding that they're going to serve as a check to John Marshall within the Supreme Court. They all fail to do so. All the people that Jefferson appoints and all the people that Madison and Monroe appoint as well will all eventually take Marshall's sides on these questions as well. And that's because they heard a lot about Marshall. They heard a lot about what kind of person he was. He was a gracious host. He would invite you into his private quarters to give you a drink of Madeira wine, his favorite beverage that he would hand out to all of his judges. It would basically be like a fraternal order of many sorts. They would sit, they would converse, they would debate. But at the end of the day, they would say, we're going to sit here, we're going to talk this out until we all come out with something that we all can agree on.
Yeah, we are not judges, we are the court.
Yes.
John Marshall, he also starts, a now dead tradition of the justices boarding together in the same house. One, because it just made fiscal sense. The judges did not get paid very much. But also, you can only imagine that helps to build that sort of fraternal order. They start referring to each other as, Brother Story, Brother Thompson, Brother Washington. You can only imagine that living together in that boarding house for those, few months out of the year, that, they could better come to understand each other in the issues facing the court.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing, and especially at this point in the history of the early republic, this idea of personal connection leading to either, advancement in politics or in the judiciary space. It's so key. And, we're already seeing that in the Madison narrative series, the importance of that social sphere to larger DC and national politics and movements. And so that is so key to that. And it's interesting to see that reflected in the court and with Marshall as well. And I think that does speak to his strength as a politician. And so one of the things at this time, and we've talked about in the narrative series, but we've also mentioned briefly here, but I'd like to take a moment to go a bit more into. So numerous cases came before the Marshall Court that dealt with relations with Native peoples. Would you mind sharing more about Marshall's impact on the federal government's policy towards Native peoples in North America?
Yeah. So the cases involving Native sovereignty, those have really been my fascination for like a few years now. So much so that, with the help of my fellow educators, I do a program called the Trilogy Cases that talks specifically and does a deep dive into the legal aspects of those cases and the ramifications. But as it pertains to the federal government's policy towards these different Native groups, Marshall's definitions of Native sovereignty in Johnson v. McIntosh, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, and Worcester v. Georgia, those cases really kicked off a seemingly never-ending debate over the legal status of different Native groups. What is clear is that it has never been universally recognized the absolute sovereignty of any Native group, even though Marshall does kind of try to. And the questions as to what the legal status of these various groups actually is still being considered by the same court. Chief Justice Marshall is credited as having established as a legitimate arm of the federal government. The case that comes to mind that even I was really blown away by, that happened relatively recently, was on the modern day Supreme Court, was Yellen v. Confederated Tribes of the Chehalis Reservation. And I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. But this case came before the modern day Supreme Court in 2021. In this case, the court needed to consider whether or not Alaskan Native corporations could be considered Indian tribes, because these aren't sovereign nations, they're something else. So the court needed to ask, can we consider them Indian tribes as defined by the 1975 Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act? It's important to note that, to my understanding, that Alaskan Native corporations are for-profit entities that in more ways than one represent indigenous people who don't have official ties to federally recognized tribes. And the people portion of that statement is really important. As it would happen, the federal government authorized billions of dollars to be given out to Indian tribes as part of its, quote, Indian tribes, as part of its 2020 COVID relief package, commonly known as the CARES Act. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court did indeed recognize those Alaskan Native corporations as Indian tribes and freed up millions of dollars of much needed federal aid. Now, the reason that I bring this case up specifically is to highlight the fact that because John Marshall was unwilling to recognize Native groups as distinct sovereign nation states the same way we might view, countries like Canada or Mexico, he kicked off this truly never-ending debate where we must constantly ask ourselves, well, if we can't classify them as absolutely sovereign, then what is their relationship to the United States? Now, thankfully, it appears as though the general attitude towards these Native groups has improved over time. I can rather confidently say that without cases like Johnson v. McIntosh, where Marshall says that these people do not have the right to sovereignty, or Flesher v. Peck to a lesser degree, that cases like Yellen would still need to be considered by the Supreme Court.
Absolutely. And that is something that we've come to time and again on the podcast, and especially as we're talking through some of the secretaries of war and the fact that diplomacy with Native peoples went through the War Department rather than the State Department, making and institutionalizing this idea that they were separate, that was a different type of sovereignty, and the fact that we are still dealing with these issues to the present day of what are these entities if they are not sovereign nations it's humbling. I mean, just the fact that we're still having these conversations.
Yeah. And it's really remarkable too, to kind of see the historiographical development of how we view these cases. I remember reading like books and articles that were published in like the 1960s and 70s. And, legal scholars would examine cases like Johnson v. McIntosh, again, where Marshall does not recognize the sovereignty of the Piankashaw people specifically, but he applies it to all of these Native groups. There were books and articles that were being written that said that actually this case formed a protection for these Native people by not allowing people who were white, encroachers to legally own their land. And, there is a reading of the case where that does make some semblance of sense, but if we look at history, that's not the case whatsoever. In fact, American encroachment on Native lands increases following these decisions. And even cases like Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, which, by modern day indigenous scholars specifically, they see that case as a failure by the court to recognize a sovereign nation. And in the same opinion, where he fails to recognize the sovereign nation, he also applauds them for their system of government and their way of life and how they've adapted to, American ideals. So even though he sees these people as, being very Americanized, he still doesn't recognize their sovereignty.
And we should also put the term American ideals in intense air quotes.
Yes. And even in Worcester v. Georgia, where John Marshall, he does declare the sovereignty of the Cherokee people, he doesn't really, have the court ask that question. It's more so assumed. But his actual decision really holds no weight. By this time, the fervor for westward expansion and the belief that there's gold on these Cherokee lands, the damage has been done. A lot of people look to the Jackson administration as, having really failed when they publicly say that they're not going to help enforce this decision. They don't believe in it. But, equal blame needs to be placed on Marshall, who really created the problem here to begin with.
Absolutely.
That said, it is interesting. It is really interesting that he does kind of develop a changing opinion about the Native people. Like I said, he essentially references the Cherokee people as being Indian savages in Johnson v. McIntosh. And by Worcester v. Georgia, he's saying, actually, this is a sovereign nation state where the laws of Georgia have no place whatsoever. That is very remarkable to see, because he doesn't have that same kind of changing opinion about any other group of people, as far as I know, specifically free and enslaved Black people. But that's one of the most fascinating parts of those cases for me personally.
Absolutely. And Ben, I think you bring up a really important point, and we're going to be talking about this more in the podcast, especially as we're starting to get to the Battle of Tippecanoe, Tecumseh, the War of 1812, things like that. We're definitely going to dive into, there are so many points in the federal government will say something, they'll ban giving alcohol to Native peoples, and that's just ignored. But whenever you have cases or you have laws that are inequitable, are increasing this inequality and this institutionalizing this inequality and separateness, those are the ones, oh yeah, we're going to follow that to the letter of the law, and we're going to take these cases, and yes, we're going to use this for westward expansion, and it is something that we have to, as American citizens, consider as part of our legacy. And to your point, this is a continued legacy. We are still dealing with this inequity today. So it's important to discuss.
I really like your language there, the institutionalization of this inequality. I really like that phrase so much, I'm probably going to work it into my programs from now on.
I would be humble and honored for you to use the phrase. But it is. And that's one thing that is fascinating about studying this time of history, and we see the institutionalization of so much that we are still dealing with to the present day, because this was a time where you had people like Marshall, you had people like Washington and Jefferson that, for better or worse, were making up new rules, were doing things that hadn't been done before, or had been done at a smaller scale, but were taking this differently and shaping and reshaping the nation and the impact that had. So it is fascinating to discuss and to explore, including the darker parts of the legacy. Very important to examine and reflect upon what is still institutionalized inequity to the present day. So, and you had mentioned, Ben, and I think this is a good segue to talking about another part of Marshall's legal legacy. So we've mentioned Paul Finkelman a couple of times. In his assessment of Marshall's judicial legacy, he noted what he described as his quote unquote pro-slavery jurisprudence. In your studies of Marshall's tenure and his work on the court, what impact do you see that the Chief Justice, or the court in general at the time, had on the institution of slavery in the U.S.?
So, at least for me, I would say it certainly normalizes the denial of freedom to Black individuals that, I should note, have legitimate legal claims. Many of these individuals, who we'll discuss shortly, really do come through a system that is stacked against them in so many regards. And especially with John Marshall, he will uphold this system, aligning himself outside established legal doctrines, I should say, that allow for these people to sue for their freedoms in court, justly so. Many cases, he returns them to slavery. And I should actually amend that statement by saying all cases that Marshall authors the opinion in, the decision, he will return that individual to bondage. That'll either be a person who was granted their freedom by a lower court, or he's upholding the decision of a lower court keeping them enslaved.
And oftentimes these cases are jury cases. So it's a jury. It's an all-white jury that grants a Black person their freedom. And Marshall, he nullifies that. He overturns it.
Yeah, and there is many of these instances here involving state laws, including the state of Maryland, including D.C. laws, which I should note is not really up to the question of federal versus state authority, because it's the District of Columbia. It's a federal district. This is a person who's brought in through a neighboring state, and they stay for a certain amount of time. And once they've been in D.C. long enough, they can legally sue for their freedom. And that's exactly what happens in this case. Nevertheless, they are granted their freedom, by a lower court. Nevertheless, Marshall turns that around and returns them back to slavery, saying actually DC law does not matter in this case, which is absurd when you look at it on its face. He's then returning it to the state that they originally came from, which, of course, when you're thinking about issues such as slavery, this would never apply to this case.
And to just throw in a little footnote there. So I think the case you're referring to is Scott v. Negro Ben, right?
Yes.
Yes. This case is really fascinating. And just to correct one thing that you said, Maryland law would apply in D.C. in those cases. And in the case of Scott v. Negro Ben, he is illegally brought into D.C. As the law reads, he should have, Scott, his enslaver, should have declared him, essentially, done administrative paperwork to declare him either with a naval officer or a tax official. He fails to do this. Now, Ben himself, not being able to represent himself in the courts because of the color of his skin, he has to find legal representation. He does successfully do that. A jury trial is called, and a jury grants him his freedom, finding that Scott violated these laws. The case is appealed to the appeals court. The appeals court agrees with the lower court's decision, and then the case gets appealed again to John Marshall's Supreme Court. And it's there that a person who's so heavily invested in the institution of slavery and has so much influence, as we talked about, over the court, he uses that to overturn this individual's freedom. He says that Maryland law was ambiguous and that administratively speaking, it's really not feasible to require this of people bringing enslaved individuals into DC, which is it's just a little bit absurd. Maryland law it's pretty clear. There's no reading of the law where Ben shouldn't be granted his freedom, but Marshall, identifying with the enslaver over the enslaved, he returns Ben to bondage, as far as we know. I think in that case, theoretically, it should have been sent back down to the lower courts and another trial be held. One thing that we would hope to do one day is to go to the state of Maryland's lower court archives and see if this case is ever retried again, because theoretically it should have been. But that's a project for the future. And admittedly, Paul Finkelman's the guy that gave me the idea to go do that. He said that it would make a really great PhD thesis one day.
It's always good to have future research plans. So
yeah, definitely. Yeah. We have no shortage of those.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. And that's the thing that's so important in studying Marshall and his legacy and his relations with slavery and enslavement. It even permeates into his work in the Supreme Court, and to see these instances where, because the proper process or the proper law was inconvenient to the enslaver, that it was just ignored even by somebody who is this pinnacle and seen as being so invested in the establishment of federal law and the federal legal system. So are there any cases that came before the Marshall Court that you feel that folks should know more about, or that had what you see as having a larger impact than what is generally understood?
I'll let the legal legacies guy handle this one.
There are a few cases that I admit I have a lot of fun reading about, and really these cases are small footnotes in Marshall's judicial legacy, admittedly so, but they really do play a bigger picture here into what we see Marshall's philosophy as being. And one of those, I think, actually comes through another slavery case, and that's the Antelope trial in 1825, where we see 4 members of the Supreme Court out of 7 at this time, so a bare majority of the court, are enslavers, and Marshall is included in this majority here, and they return part of 212 captive Africans into slavery in Spain and Portugal. And I should note this is in direct violation of the United States' own laws dealing with the international slave trade. So kind of to go into more background on this case, it's considered really to be Marshall's most famous slavery case. It's probably the one that's the most well-known among those who study the topic. But the Antelope is really regarded the attempted smuggling of captive Africans into the United States decades after the passage of the transatlantic slave trade ban in 1808, something that just came up in your narrative, Jerry. But in 1819, Portuguese and Spanish privateers commandeered the American ship, the Antelope, filled it with approximately 300 captive Africans, and sailed to the coast of Spanish Florida, intending to sell the individuals. But American federal authorities seized the Antelope as it was in American waters, and they discovered the illegal cargo, escorted the vessel to Savannah, Georgia, where the U.S. took custody of the Africans. This violates American federal law, what the slave traders had done here. So the slave traders from the Antelope and the now 212 captive Africans, and I should note, some had succumbed to disease, others were stolen once they reached land in Savannah, so they were taken into slavery to places that remain to this day completely unknown. And this endured through 6 years of legal proceedings before it finally actually reached the Marshall Court in 1825. So we don't know what could have happened to many of these individuals originally. It's close to 300, but by the time it actually comes to the Marshall Court, it's closer to 200. And the Chief Justice heard from Spanish and Portuguese claimants about legal ownership of the captives. So the question before Marshall really then became, are these captives enslaved or free? And if it's the former, they belong to their captors. If the latter, Marshall felt that the Africans should be returned to Africa as part of that colonization idea that he is so friendly toward. But ultimately, Marshall will honor the ownership claims of some of the captives as being legally enslaved to the Spanish, and he returned those individuals to their enslavers. And I should quote Paul Finkelman once again when I say, Finkelman writes, quote, Marshall ruled that the remaining Africans were to be handed over to the U.S. government as fruit of the illegal trade. And Finkelman concludes, quote, Marshall admitted that the African trade was contrary to the law of nature, but asserted that it was consistent with the law of nations and cannot itself be piracy. So in order for Marshall to reach this verdict, there's a few things that he has to do. He has to ignore federal law, which banned the transatlantic slave trade and participation in it as piracy, as it's granted in this law from 1808. And Marshall then felt compelled to respect other countries' participation in the slave trade, namely Spain and Portugal, even if it was illegal in the United States. So he is putting other countries' laws, even though this is something that's happening on American soil, he's putting these other countries' priorities on top of American federal law during this period here. So in the Antelope, Marshall, once again, because this is closer to the end of his time on the court, this is less than 10 years before his death, we really see that growing trend now that has been there in so many of these cases, like Scott v. Negro Ben, Me McQueen, cases such as those, like LaGrange versus Chuteau that came later. But we really see Marshall once again prioritizing the right to property over the right to liberty. So he essentially condones this illegal act of attempting to smuggle captured Africans into the United States by focusing his arguments on property claims. Throughout the years of proceedings, the 200-some captured Africans lived and labored in Georgia and continued to do so until the United States returned them to Africa. So that really shows there is a financial gain to prolonging this legal process, especially in local and state courts.
And you know, it should also be noted that this is essentially a direct expansion of the institution of slavery that it goes against the laws that are on the books. You know, we see Marshall as this, or, you know, Marshall is often remembered as this great legal mind, this legal theorist, this jurist. But here we see him pretty clearly being willing to defy the legal principles that are before him on the court in favor of expanding the institution of slavery. Now, it's expanding, you know, a relatively small amount, but it is an expansion nonetheless. And this is probably a massive overreach by the court.
Yeah, and it's an important precedent that Roger Taney, as Chief Justice, will definitely build upon in Dred Scott versus Sanford. So when many people tend to look at, and I've noticed this trend in biographies, people tend to look at Roger Taney and John Marshall as being polar opposites from each other, one being very pro-national government, one being very states' rights-oriented. On this issue of slavery, they're very similar. Yeah. One could almost say that
Marshall's more radical.
Marshall would be more radical in terms of the expansion of slavery in this case. Because by the time you get to the 1850s with the Dred Scott decision, Taney is really following a trend that's already been accepted as the perceived view by a majority of those in the South. Yeah. So he's really only just taking their ideology and putting it in a court decision there. Yeah. Marshall is doing something of his own thinking in this Antelope case. And that's really the key difference there that really lays the judge at the center of the blame in this aspect here.
Yeah.
But to kind of go in some other cases, Jerry, that I love to talk about here.
And before you do that, I actually wanted to mention, and I was actually, as you were talking about this, Matthew, it made me think of a case that actually came before the Taney court, which is the Amistad case, which is a more, probably more well known than the Antelope case. But now I'm just thinking, I'm like, how did that go into the Amistad decision? How was that precedent considered in what, there are some nuances and some differences, but there are definitely some correlations here as well. And it is fascinating to think about, the fact that in the Amistad case, even though there's so much to dissect and we won't go down that tangent, but it was a different ruling. And I think that does kind of point to that Marshall in some ways is more radical than Taney and his court.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Marshall is definitely a precedent setter in more ways than one.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
But we have an entire program really in the fall that focuses on the next case that I'd like to talk about. And this comes up on the anniversary of this trial's verdict and the ramifications that it has. And of course, it happened right here in Richmond. And that's the Aaron Burr treason trials of 1807. Now, I know you already covered this very much in depth in your narrative series. So that relieves me of some of the responsibility of going over the details of this case here. But really, it comes down to actually two cases that kind of fall under the same event. And the first one of these is the case of Ex parte Bowman and Swartwout, I believe is the pronunciation.
That's my best guess.
That's my best guess as well. But that comes earlier in 1807, which that held that the constitutional definition of treason excluded mere conspiracy to levy war against the United States. So Eric Bowman and Samuel Swartwout were civilians that became implicated in the whole Burr-Wilkinson plot. I could ramble all day about James Wilkinson. What a character. And I think you did that justice in your narrative series.
Oh, yeah.
Chaos,
and we're not done yet. There's still more Wilkinson to come, listeners.
Don't we know it all too well. But that plot, supposedly consisting of Burr and Wilkinson attempting to create an empire, that comes down to the Supreme Court being asked in this case, in regards to Bowman and Swartwout, they were accused of attempting to recruit others into the plot. But these individuals were informed the military, which promptly arrested them. So they gave themselves up in this aspect here. So the Supreme Court then decides that, and this is quoting the decision, to constitute a levying of war, there must be an assemblage of persons for the purpose of effecting by force a treasonable purpose. Enlistments of men to serve against government is not sufficient. That's going to play a big role as a significant precedent for what defines treason. And that's going to really tie into the final verdict on Burr's culpability. When Marshall then asks the jury to acquit Burr, it's based on two presumptions. It's going to be the first being that there has to be an actual act of force, an actual overt act as it's defined in the treason clause of the Constitution. And secondly, there has to be effective testimony from two witnesses to that same overt act. And as we see from our friend James Wilkinson, that testimony is not as clear-cut as it could be. We find out then, of course, as you've already mentioned, that letter was forged by Wilkinson, that claimed to have been written by Burr, going over all the details of his plot. So that pretty much ruined Jefferson's prosecution for this case. And that's what makes it so easy for Marshall to ask for Burr's acquittal in this case. But it is no less political, of course, because it's very partisan conflict during this period. And it even leads to Marshall being burned in effigy in places like Baltimore, Maryland, and even in Virginia, where so many are opposed to Marshall by this time.
And I have to throw in there that Matthew and I, if anybody's ever in Richmond, Virginia, or in September, we do an entire tour in conjunction with the Valentine Museum, where John Wickham, one of Aaron Burr's defense attorneys, historic house is. We do a tour in conjunction with them all about the treason trial. We dive into some of the details and some of the everlasting impacts of that case. This is one of the first cases where it truly needs to be considered. What is an impartial juror and what defines treason? So that's a fun program that is kind of Matthew's and I's baby that we do in September every year.
Wow, I will have to remember that.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say Marshall made the right call by saying that an impartial juror is definitely someone who is not promised a blank pardon by the President of the United States.
Yes.
Just that little thing.
It's just a little thing, right? That's our little subtle poke at Jefferson for this episode here.
Yeah, during the program, we do much more Jefferson bashing. If there's any Jeffersonians out there, like, just be prepared for that.
You're in good company on this podcast. So.
And speaking of Jefferson again, it sets a significant precedent for subpoenaing the president for records and information that is relevant to an important case. Marshall agrees that the president can be subpoenaed for documents that Burr himself claims during the trial will prove his innocence. If the president has access to this information, that will make or break a case. And in this case, it's literally a question of life or death, right? Burr will be hanged if he's found guilty of treason. So under Marshall's ruling, of course, the president is subservient to the law just like any other American citizen. This serves as a really important precedent for the relations between the president and the judiciary, something that Marshall and Jefferson, they're bickering back and forth to each other, is really going to help build precedent for that. But this is going to come into play in more recent years, especially with the Watergate scandals and the holding of the Nixon tapes. You know, the Supreme Court, in a unanimous ruling, says Nixon has to hand over this relevant information, these tapes. And that's what happens in this case. And then more recently, President Donald Trump's subpoena from the state of New York for financial documents. Whatever people's feelings might be on that, I won't dive too deeply into. But the precedent for a state court or the Supreme Court subpoenaing a president for materials comes all the way back from this trial in 1807.
A subpoena decum, that's the full Latin word, or the Latin phrase.
Well, and it's just so fascinating. That's one of the reasons why I did a bit of a deep dive on the Burr trial, because not only is there so much precedent in that case, but then also the fact that at the time, this is, nearly 200 years before you get court TV and televised courts, but the nation was watching as best they could. You had people flooding into Richmond to actually witness the trial. The letters coming out, folks were reporting on what happened on the trial on the state, and the fact that it generated so much interest is just, it's a fascinating point to explore.
Yeah. I mean, that case in and of itself, even though I don't think it's talked about all that often, it has its own legacy.
Yeah.
And the impacts of it are, anybody who goes into a courtroom as on jury duty and gets dismissed, that you can tie that directly into this case.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you also, it makes it a lot harder to rightfully convict somebody of treason. And that's for the betterment of American society, I would argue, because a lot of the problem was that Burr was, saying mean things about Thomas Jefferson, and he was saying mean things about the state of the country. And could somebody be charged with treason for just speaking ill will against the sitting members of government? And it's ironic that this is coming from Thomas Jefferson, right?
Yeah.
Because we just saw less than a decade before this, all the furor over the Alien and Sedition Acts, which I should mention, Marshall was not an advocate for that.
Yeah, he denounces those when he runs for Congress.
Yeah, which of course will help him here in Virginia, where animosity is pretty strong against those. But we saw the persecution of Democratic Republicans who spoke out against the federal government and the Adams administration. And now Jefferson is turning this around, and he's willing to charge a man with treason for doing essentially the same thing and supposedly plotting against the government to form some nation state there. And it should also be mentioned that there was kind of a widely held assumption during this time that the United States would quickly break into two or more countries. Jefferson himself believed this. Aaron Burr believed this. So could it really then be listed as treason for creating a separate nation state if it was something that many people within the American political system expected to happen? But again, Marshall will really take this forward by making it difficult to charge someone with treason. And everybody on both sides of the political aisle today, as fiercely polarized as people can be and how much people like to argue about politics, they should all be very happy that they will not get charged with treason for doing so at any given time.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. And as listeners of the podcast know, there's so many times that Jefferson and his pre-presidency and the ideals that he had when he became president. He does a complete 180, and this is an important one, especially for somebody who made the point of, we need to be cautious about what we do, about the laws, about the precedents that we set, because they could have ramifications that we may not see right now. And this one, to your point, Matthew, would have had huge ramifications and could have been a power abused so much and sent American history in widely varying directions.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more with that assessment. And we really have John Marshall to thank in this particular regard, with his ability of having a strict construction of the treason clause for the reasons already mentioned. And it really does play even in today's highly polarized climate.
Yeah. I always like to say, one of the few things that is incredibly clearly defined in the Constitution is what treason is. And, that's evident in this case.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But I do actually have one more case that I do like to talk about, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So this case is Dartmouth College v. Woodward in 1819. Now, this is personally my favorite obscure Marshall case, because it is something that has to do with a state fighting with a college about whether or not the charter can be changed in this regard here. And this actually comes down to deeply held philosophical principles that are held by Federalists and held by Jeffersonians. So to kind of give, again, another background into this, way back in 1769, you saw King George III grant a charter for Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. This document spelled out the purposes of the school, it set up the structure to govern it, and it gave land to the college. But in 1816, now you have the United States. New Hampshire is no longer a British colony. Over 30 years after the end of the Revolution, I should say, the legislature in New Hampshire alters Dartmouth's charter in order to reinstate the college's deposed president, place the ability to appoint positions in the hands of the governor, and it adds new members to the Board of Trustees, and it creates a state board of visitors with veto power over trustee decisions. So this effectively converts the school from a private institution to a public one. In the college's book of records, corporate seal, other corporate property were all removed. And so the trustees of the college naturally objected to this. They saw this as an attack on their sovereignty as a corporation and sought to have the actions of the legislature declared unconstitutional in court. So the trustees, they retained Dartmouth alumnus Daniel Webster, who would later become a U.S. Senator and Secretary of State in his own right. But he argued for the college in this case against William Woodward, who's the state-approved secretary of the new Board of Trustees. But Webster's speech really came down through the annals of history for his strong endorsement of this college. He describes it as, quote, a small college, but yet there are those who love it. And it's a really deep personal connection to this here. And it is so moving, according to contemporary accounts at the time, that it helps convince Chief Justice Marshall in his overall decision here. And the decision's handed down in February 1819, and it rules in favor of the college. And it invalidates the act of the New Hampshire legislature. This is an important precedent for two reasons. This is the Supreme Court asserting its ability to strike down a state law. And I should mention that this was only the second time it had done this. The first one was in Fletcher versus Peck, where it struck down Georgia's law claiming the Yazoo land grant deals, striking down that as unconstitutional. But this reaffirms Marshall's belief in the sanctity of a contract, which was also upheld in Fletcher v. Peck, and is necessary to the functioning of a republic. And the court rules that the college's corporate charter qualified as a contract between private parties. The king and his trustees, the legislature could not interfere in this. And even though the United States is no longer royal colonies, the contract was still valid because the Constitution says that a state could not pass laws to impair a contract. So Marshall is asserting the federal supremacy there of the contract clause to be able to use that. And I should mention he uses this also to assert the institution of slavery in many regards. But here in this case, he's using it for a good purpose here. He's asserting the right of this college to be held in regards here as its own private entity. And it really protects corporate interests in the long term here. And this decision, like I said, was not without precedent. This had already been, the court had already invalidated a state act in Fletcher v. Peck. But and this basically says, that contracts, no matter how they were procured or when they were procured, cannot be invalidated by state legislation. And here's where that interferes with philosophically held principles that are held by the likes of, his name comes up once more, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was not a fan of the Fletcher case, nor of the Dartmouth College case. He had basically made a commiseration with New Hampshire's governor, William Plummer, that stated essentially that the earth belongs in usufruct to the living. That was one of Jefferson's core principles that he held throughout his life, dating back from his time in France when he fell in love with French revolutionary principles. He would take that into his time in the United States, saying, the dead cannot bind the living to contracts that the people of today do not agree with, right? And many of the people, you could probably say, did not agree with this contract that Dartmouth College was doing here. So Jefferson believed that the will of the people, the will of the elected officials, not the courts that were so far removed from the will of everyday people, that they should be the ones that are making these decisions about contracts and their suitability. So popular opinion influenced some state courts and legislatures to declare that the state governments had an absolute right to amend or repeal a corporate charter. But the courts, however, imposed limitations to this, which, of course, did not make Thomas Jefferson a very happy camper in that regard there. So we see after the Dartmouth decision, actually some states really lash out back at the Supreme Court at this. Many states wanted more control, so they passed laws or state constitutional amendments that gave themselves the general right to alter or revoke at will, which the courts found to be a valid reservation. And the courts had established, however, that the alteration or revocation of private charters or laws authorizing private charters must be reasonable and cannot cause harm to the members. And this is going to be really important in protecting, company founders, stockholders, and the like. So we see those financial ideals that come in McCulloch v. Maryland. We see the trumping of state law and monopoly that comes down in Gibbons v. Ogden. And we see that principle of judicial review that we see in Marbury. All three of these principles come together, making this, I almost want to say, because I'm such a legal nerd, a beautifully succinct case here that really showcases all of Marshall's judicial philosophies rolled up in one package.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that, because I think that really gets to, and we've come on this in the podcast in numerous ways, but I think it really helps to highlight the key differences between, Marshall's viewpoints versus Jefferson's, that here Jefferson, he still saw kind of the states as being supreme, and Marshall really didn't. He saw that the federal government was, had this authority over the states, and the importance of these contracts and these binding contracts versus Jefferson, who felt that we should rip up the Constitution every 20 years because why not? That's not going to create chaos. but it really does speak to, and especially the fact that we're still having some of these same discussions nowadays. We're still having discussions about where federal authority ends, state authority begins, what we can do, and government authority versus private authority, business authority. So it is a fascinating case. And you mentioned a name that we are going to be talking about quite a bit on the podcast moving forward, Daniel Webster. And so it's interesting to see him in the mix as well.
Yeah, he actually plays a big role in all of these key Marshall decisions. He's in Gibbons v. Ogden. He's in McCulloch v. Maryland. He takes a lot of practice also in the Aaron Burr trials as well. Mm-hmm. He plays such a dynamic role in so many of these cases that get mentioned again and again and again when talking about John Marshall, that he really is one of the key lawyers and public speakers of his time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you mentioned one that we're actually going to be talking about not too long in the future in the Madison presidency narrative, Fletcher v. Peck. So little preview for the listeners that this is coming, the first overturning of a state law. So stay tuned for that. And so naturally, as we've seen, there is so much to say about Marshall's legacy and impact when it comes to the American judicial system. But of course, as this is a podcast focused on the presidencies of the United States, I had to ask. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what we can say about Marshall's impact on U.S. presidential history.
Well, I could say it definitely played a big role in forming the relationship between the presidency and the judiciary. President John Adams is known to have once said that Marshall was the most important founding father never to have become president himself. And I don't think that's with that much exaggeration. It certainly was a lot of importance that came with Marshall's role in founding the judiciary as its principal. But in order to effectively do that, he had to effectively form a relationship with the other branches of government that could help build up that branch. And he does that with Congress. And for the purposes of this conversation, with the executive, his work frequently overlapped with that of the executive. We often hear about his judicial decisions on the Supreme Court and the world in which he lived that shaped those decisions. But we really seldom hear about his relationship with the American presidency and the men who occupied that office. And in addition to, he had childhood and Revolutionary War friendships with future presidents James Monroe and James Madison. In fact, him and Monroe were actually classmates together growing up. And during his 50 plus years in public service, Marshall worked in some capacity with many other American presidents. Of course, George Washington famously sends him a letter asking him to become Attorney General, and he turns him down because he would rather continue his private law practice in Richmond, Virginia.
I do wonder if this is one of the first times that an American president is like denied, what they're seeking,
and especially George Washington.
Yeah, a man that Marshall revered so much, he wrote a 5-volume biography about the guy.
Yeah. But Marshall could not be bothered to become Attorney General.
No.
He could not do that in that instance there.
No, sir. He was busy in Richmond.
And as your Seat at the Table series really so eloquently shows, there's such a revolving door of people coming in and out and in and out, and you end up kind of getting left with the bottom of the barrel in some cases there of people who are kind of more opportunistic and looking for these experiences there that will just kind of help them get a next step to the highest thing. And that's kind of why they're careers become so mediocre and so ill remembered. But Marshall, I should also mention, for being the longest serving Chief Justice in American history for 34 years, he would have the most presidential inaugurations out of any Chief Justice. He would swear in 5 presidents on 9 different occasions in the course of his 34 years. We see Thomas Jefferson in 1801 and 1805, James Madison in 1809 and 1813, James Monroe, his buddy, his pal, which I'm sure he was very glad to have instead of Thomas Jefferson, in 1817 and 1821. He swears him in. John Quincy Adams, another friend, and of course the son of the man who appoints him to the court, in 1825, and Andrew Jackson in 1829 and 1833. Now, I would actually go as far to say that as much as Jefferson and Marshall disagreed with each other and fought along partisan lines, that would really be relegated to the private spaces of their lives. They would write mean things to each other in their private correspondences about each other, but none of them actually saw what each other was writing. They didn't see what they were doing there. When it came to Andrew Jackson, things would go a little bit differently.
As with everything with Andrew Jackson.
As with everything with Andrew Jackson.
He ruffled a few feathers.
He ruffled a few feathers. He shot a few guys in the duels.
Yeah.
What's not to complain about there? But Marshall would actually actively campaign against Jackson's presidency. In 1828, during that election, he calls for the re-election of John Quincy Adams, which is something that's pretty much unheard of today, a sitting Chief Justice taking sides in a presidential election. But this was how much danger, how much of a threat Jackson was seen as by John Marshall. He viewed him essentially as a demagogue, as an official who was just advancing the seeds that Jefferson had laid down and continuing a policy that would lead to the complete dissolution of the Union and basically returning us back to the state of affairs during the Articles of Confederation. And what we see with Jackson here, what's ironic there, is because he actually ends up being almost more of a nationalist than John Marshall is. He turns things around, especially during the nullification crisis, and threatens to send an army into the South. And this is something that Marshall actually agrees with Jackson on quite a good bit. And I should also mention that part about Jackson being viewed as a demagogue. Thomas Jefferson also viewed him as being a demagogue, but I think he failed to see the connection between the seeds that he had planted through his big talk of the will of the people and the will of the people should prevail, how that could grow into kind of the behemoth that he saw it as by the time of the Jacksonian democracy there.
And if I might interject just a little note on kind of precedent setting as far as, Marshall's relationship to the presidency. He wanted to retire in his, by the election of 1832, he's 77 years old. Yeah. He very much, his health was definitely declining. He very much wanted to retire. And that's, one of the reasons he campaigns against Jackson is so that, somebody who isn't Jackson can win the presidency and he can go ahead and take a step back. And Marshall really sets a precedent of, judges, maintaining their posts, for periods longer than they really wanted to in an effort to maintain their political ideologies on the court. Today there are a lot of conversations being had about, if and when justices should retire. We just had a justice retire who, a year ago said, absolutely not, I will not retire. But ultimately he stepped down so that somebody younger that carries similar ideologies to him can be put in his place and those ideologies maintained within the court for a longer period of time.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And when it comes down to people like James Madison and James Monroe, this was kind of like the calming period in the middle of Marshall's tenure. He actually had pretty good relations with Madison and Monroe, and they would both appoint people to the court that actually ended up thinking more in lines with Marshall. Joseph Story, who was appointed in 1812 by President Madison, he becomes one of Marshall's closest friends and colleagues throughout his entire life that he has. He basically serves as a partner, a protege of his. So much so, really, that near the end of Marshall's life, as his health is failing, but he refuses to quit because somebody needs to stand up to Jackson, as Ben mentioned. Mm-hmm. Story kind of becomes the person tasked with writing the opinions, but they're all pretty much given verbatim by Marshall in this aspect here. So Marshall is tasking another justice with carrying on its legacy there. But that camaraderie that we also see with the court starts falling apart during the Jacksonian era as well, because Jackson, I always like to compare Jefferson and Jackson in this way. Jefferson was a thinker and Jackson was a doer. So the things that Jackson would think about, his passions, his will to do something, he would immediately act on it. Jefferson would sit back and kind of think more theoretically about things.
And write a dozen letters to anybody who would listen.
Oh, yes.
And complain to James Madison about the fact that the Constitution needs to be overturned, when Madison's sitting there going, I'm the guy who wrote this stuff, right? It was essentially, just throw all of his life work down the drain, right, if he did this. But when it came down to Jackson later on, he appoints a lot more partisan people to the court, people that are not afraid to stand up to John Marshall like the way that Jefferson thought his people would do. But essentially then what actually ended up happening is Marshall starts finding himself in the minority in some decisions there. He finds himself in the dissent, like we mentioned earlier with Cherokee Nation versus the state of Georgia. And Jackson would be constantly fighting the rulings of the Marshall Court. And when Worcester v. Georgia came down in 1832, which was basically Marshall, rebuking the state of Georgia for its seizing of the lands of Cherokee lands, Jackson refuses to even enforce this decision. It was the great fear that Marshall always had would happen to the court, that a president who he disagreed with ideologically,
or any branch of the government for that matter,
or it could be Congress as well, or the states, they would just simply refuse to even acknowledge the Supreme Court decision. And this is a dangerous precedent that we see happen after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 with the policy of massive resistance that's taken up by states like our home states of Virginia and North Carolina, rather closing schools than abiding by the Supreme Court decision. This is a policy that has historical precedent in Andrew Jackson. Of course, there's the famous line that Jackson probably never actually said, which is that John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, which is essentially, just throwing this decision in the trash and refusing to acknowledge it in this case. And this actually leads Marshall near the end of his life to view his career as a failure. He does not think that his mission to champion these Federalist principles that have been carried down to him by George Washington, by his years in the Revolutionary War, his time at Valley Forge, he thinks he's failed in his mission to actually carry this forward. And now it's being completely eliminated by the Jacksonians and their radical democracy policies. This would have been his views during this period here. So we kind of think this would have encouraged him to destroy a lot of his personal correspondence that we see as well.
Yeah, he probably wouldn't be too excited that we're interpreting his house as a historic site.
Wow, and it's so interesting to see figures, looking back on their life and their legacy, and then from our standpoint to see something completely different. It's and it does speak to, he did have this long legacy and long impact, and we're going to be talking about him for quite a while in terms of his connections to U.S. presidential history. But I greatly appreciate the insight and perspective that y'all have provided in kind of focusing in on Marshall and understanding him and his career a bit more from his perspective, because I think that's really going to inform as we go along in the narrative and study it from the president's point of view or the administration's point of view. What was happening on the other side, what was happening in the Supreme Court and from Marshall's point of view. And so any last thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience on Marshall's life, his career, his legacy beyond what we talked about today that you think would be helpful for the audience to understand as we're moving forward and as we're examining, going back to that presidential lens, but to know about Marshall?
Yeah, I often get this question from like guests that we interact with through our programming and our tours. I often get people asking me questions, like how should I feel about John Marshall? Or they ask the same questions about, people like, Jefferson or Jackson, who have historically been, kind of held in the limelight as these pinnacles of early American ideals. And, you get the same thing with Marshall. If I give somebody a tour of the house and, I talk about Marshall's views on federalism and how he implements his agenda on the court, but at the same time talk about how he completely fails to recognize the sovereignty of, free people and native nations, or denies the freedom of Black individuals that have legitimate legal rights to them. They ask this question, how should I feel about Marshall? And, usually the answer is not a satisfying one. It's like, I don't know. You do with this information what you will. There's very little that I've said here today that I have inferred from studying John Marshall. I'm largely just quoting him. So, Marshall's and pretty much every president's legacy is a very complicated thing, and different people are going to interpret that legacy in different ways. And that's exactly how it should be. But the important thing to take away is that by engaging with this history, whether that be through listening to a podcast, visiting a museum, taking a tour at a historic site, or reading a book, to engage with this history, to me, that really is the act of preserving that history. If not, financially or writing it down, just by preserving it within your own minds. And that's, one of the reasons that we really appreciate being able to come on to this podcast is to talk about that legacy, and to allow people to engage with this history that may not have been able to engage with it before.
Absolutely.
Matthew, any profound thoughts to add to that?
I don't think I could have said it better myself. I mean, this is an opportunity that any humble tour guides like ourselves would kill for. And this is something that has really given us a great opportunity to tell more people why they should remember someone like John Marshall. Even though he was Secretary of State for only about 9 months, his 34-year career as Chief Justice really was one that was transformational for the court as we remember it today. And his relationships with men like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, James Madison, and many other names that I could spend all day recounting were really transformational in the formation of our early republic and tie in so well with the history of the American presidency as a whole. And I think that's something that your listeners can certainly relate to as avid followers of this podcast. And I think even the layman's historian could really relate with this as well. I mean, as for me, my interest in American history originally came from interest in American presidents, remembering their names, where they came from, what party they were, how long they were in office. These were all things that drew me into the larger scope of American history and led me to the path I am on today. So this is another step in a remarkable journey of being a historian. And so, again, I couldn't thank you enough for this opportunity, Jerry. Thank you.
Absolutely. No worries. And likewise, I can't thank y'all enough for the insight and perspective. And and the passion for your work that you've exhibited. And talking about that journey ahead, as we wrap up, I want to give you an opportunity to share anything that's coming up at the John Marshall House or any research that you're working on right now, kind of what the path ahead looks like for y'all.
Yeah. So one really big thing, if any listeners out there are in the education space, teachers, administrators, whatever, we just recently went live on Streamable Learning. It's an online platform that brings educators like us from old historic houses into the classrooms of students all over the country. So anybody out there that's in the education space that's interested in that, we are available on that platform. We offer K through 12 programs, everything from legal history to Revolutionary War history to the history of enslavement. And, we do have a couple of events that are coming up just kind of locally to us. Like I said, if anybody's ever traveling through Richmond, please stop by. We're open Wednesdays through Sundays. In early September, like I said, Matthew and I will be conducting our Aaron Burr Treason Trial tours with the Valentine Museum in October. And also at different times throughout the months, we'll also be hosting our haunted history tours. Those are tours of the house that we do at night where we kind of explore some of the darker parts of the history of the home that we don't often get to talk about. And every month we offer free virtual programs on a variety of topics. We have To Be Purchased and Possessed, my trilogy cases, Matthew's Legal Legacies program. Those are completely free. Donations are appreciated though. And of course, just check out our website, preservationvirginia.org. We always have upcoming events, talks, lectures, whatever, at any of the various historic sites across Virginia. And, the last thing that I'll add, we are a nonprofit. Donations are always appreciated. Every dollar that we get, it goes directly back into the house, goes directly back into research, interpretations, and programming. So anybody who's willing and able, please do check out our website.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anything to add?
No, I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
We got everything covered. That's pretty much our schedule for the rest of the year. So anybody who is looking to come by, like Ben said, we're open Wednesday through Sunday. Our hours during weekdays are 11 to 2. And then on Saturdays is from 10 to 5 and Sundays is from 12 to 5.
And we can, if you have a big group or whatever, just shoot us an email. We're always willing to work and schedule big groups and things like that. And of course, if anybody, for whatever reason, needs to get in contact with Matthew or myself or anybody that works at the John Marshall House, just shoot us an email at johnmarshallhouse@preservationvirginia.org. But with that, Matthew, what do you think? Should I leave them with the little quote from Joseph's story?
I think you should.
I'm going to leave you guys with a little quote that Matthew and I think really sums up the life of John Marshall. It's a quote given to us from a man named Joseph Story. We talked about a little bit, one of John Marshall's closest friends and colleagues on the Supreme Court, also a frequent drinker with the man. Their favorite beverage was Madeira wine. Well, he once said in reference to Marshall, he was raised on Madeira and federalism and was not one to stray away from those early prejudices. And we think that's very true in both his private and his public life.
I couldn't think of a better way to close out this episode. Ben, Matthew, thank you so much. And for our listeners, I will share links to Preservation Virginia and the John Marshall House around the release of this episode. It'll also be in the sources for this episode. But thank y'all so much again for helping us to better understand the life and legacy of this figure in American history that isn't always a focus whenever we're talking about presidential history, but I think that the listeners will agree and understand had such an impact on this part of history as well as American history in general. And his legacy is still having an impact to the present day. So thank y'all so much for being here.
Well, thank you once again, Jerry. I can't tell you how fun this was for us. I mean, our Saturdays are usually full of like sitting around talking about history, but this was so much better than that was.
You get to share the conversation with the audience.
Yes, most definitely.
Yeah, thank you for giving us an opportunity to ramble to a wider audience for a change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Greatly appreciated.
That's what we do here at Presidencies. Well, and everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
History is complicated. The story of human progress is long, messy, and riddled with controversies big and small. On Conflicted, we dive headfirst into history's most infamous events and contentious figures. We try and untangle the good from the bad, the fact from the fiction, and the monsters from the misunderstood. Was Genghis Khan a murderous butcher or a civic pioneer? Did the Allied powers go too far in firebombing the German city of Dresden at the twilight of World War II? And how did the Marquis de Sade acquire such a sinister reputation? And was any of it true? These are just a few of the tough questions we wrestle with and investigate on Conflicted. So if you love history or just enjoy a good story, please join me, your host, Zach Cornwell, for a fascinating new topic each and every month. Conflicted, a history podcast, is available on Spotify, Apple, or wherever else you get your podcasts. I hope to see you soon.